What if Hollywood's most trusted father figure was the one quietly breaking his family apart from the inside? You know Rob Reiner. You've seen his name roll across credits for decades. The Princess Bride. When Harry Met Sally. A Few Good Men. He was the man behind the magic, the liberal lion of Los Angeles, the face of moral clarity in a morally bankrupt town. But behind the camera? Behind closed doors? That's where this story begins, and it's not the fairy tale you were sold. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because for one woman, who dusted his statues and folded his laundry for 14 years, the real Rob Reiner was anything but noble. According to her, he was cruel, petty, vindictive, and worst of all, she claims he was emotionally abusive to the very people who loved him most, his wife Michelle and his son Nick. And now, they're both dead. You've heard the headlines. Rob and Michelle Reiner, murdered in their Brentwood estate, found stabbed to death. Their son, Nick, arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But what if, just what if, that night of bloodshed wasn't the beginning of the story, but the final chapter in a decades-long emotional war? A war this Maid says Rob started. A war his family paid the ultimate price for. She never planned to speak, never wanted the spotlight. But after years of silence, after watching the world canonize Rob as a Hollywood saint and demonize Nick as a monster, she says she can't stay quiet anymore. Because she was there. She heard the yelling. She saw the manipulation. And she saw something else too. A boy slowly unraveling under the crushing weight of a father's cold expectations. I saw him make Nick cry, she said, her voice shaking, and then blame Michelle for it. He said she was too soft, that she made Nick weak. He called her a failure. Now imagine being that child. Imagine crying in front of your father, only to be told that you're the embarrassment, that your tears are your mother's fault, that you'll never be a man. Imagine living like that every day, in a house where nothing was ever enough, where silence was your only protection, where love had conditions. Can you picture it? Because that's what Nick lived through, and that's what this video is going to expose. For years, Rob Reiner used his platform to fight for justice, civil rights, marriage equality, anti-Trump campaigns. He was loud, passionate, convincing. But while he was protesting tyranny in the streets, was he creating it in his own home? What happens when a man who preaches empathy shows none behind closed doors? What happens when the father Hollywood praised becomes the tyrant his son feared? What happens when the person you're told to admire is the very reason a family fell apart? Because the truth is, we've seen this before. We've seen public heroes turn out to be private nightmares. We've seen the smiles for the cameras and the screaming that follows when the lights go off. But this story, this one cuts deeper, because it ended in blood. And it started, the Maid says, with tears. Tears from a boy who just wanted to be seen, wanted to be heard, wanted to be loved, not compared, corrected, or crushed. And maybe that boy finally snapped. You're going to hear things in this video that will challenge everything you think you know about the Reiner family. Things the media glossed over. Things the lawyers won't touch. Things that were never meant to get out. You'll learn about a hidden journal, a late-night argument over inheritance, a secret recording tucked behind a fireplace brick, and a handwritten letter from Michelle Reiner herself, delivered in a sealed envelope the Maid kept hidden for months. But let's rewind. Before the sirens, before the blood, before the headlines screamed double murder and Nick's mugshot flooded the airwaves. Let's go back to the beginning, to a quiet, sun-drenched mansion in Brentwood, a $13.5 million estate with ocean views, white marble floors, and a guest house where a troubled 32-year-old man lived in isolation. Let's go back to the Maid's first day, the creaking floors, the whispered rules, the cold greetings. Let's go back to the family dinners that weren't really dinners, but performances. Let's go back to the therapy sessions no one took seriously. Let's go back to the words no one said out loud, but everyone felt. He was a devil, she said again. Not all the time. Not to everyone. But when he was, you could feel it in your bones. So how did it get this far? How does a family go from red carpets and awards to autopsies and prison jumpsuits? How does a son go from rehab to homicide? And how did no one, not one friend, not one colleague, stop it? Or did they all look away? Because here's the contradiction. Rob Reiner was a genius. He was influential. He did change lives on screen. But what if the life he couldn't fix was his own son's? And what if Michelle, the woman who stood beside him for 35 years, saw it coming, but was too afraid to act? What if the truth isn't that Nick turned into a killer, but that he was made into one? Crafted, molded, broken by the very hands that were supposed to protect him. In the chapters ahead, you'll walk through the full timeline, from the first red flag to the fatal night. You'll hear from multiple staff members who now say they were told to ignore Nick's breakdowns. You'll learn about this Sunday ritual where Rob allegedly mocked Nick's therapy progress to his friends. And you'll see how Michelle tried, in her own quiet way, to break the cycle. But by the time she found the strength to act, the damage was done. Because the question isn't who stabbed whom. It's who created the blade in the first place, and who held it over their heads for years, emotionally, psychologically, and finally, fatally. Still think you know the full story? Still think this was a cut-and-dry case of a spoiled Hollywood kid losing it? Still think Rob Reiner died a hero? Then you're not ready for what comes next. Because the Maid's final memory of Nick Reiner is not what you'd expect. It wasn't violent. It wasn't unhinged. It was calm, almost peaceful, and it happened just hours after the murders. She saw him through the window, pacing in the garden, shirtless, muttering, holding something that looked like a bloodied towel. And then he stopped. He looked up at the stars, as if searching for something, and said one word she never understood, until she found the note behind the fridge. And that one word changed everything. What was the word? Why would a 32-year-old man, hours after his parents were brutally stabbed to death, whisper something to the stars, and then leave a note that made the Maid fall to her knees when she read it? She wouldn't say the word right away. Not to the police. Not to the press. Not even to Nick's lawyer. She kept it close. But what we do know is this. That note unlocked a part of the Reiner family's darkness no one wanted to touch. And once it came out, suddenly, Rob didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a warning. Let me ask you something. When you hear about family murders, what do you picture? A drug-fueled rage? Mental illness boiling over? A sudden, random snap? What if it wasn't random? What if it was scripted? Because here's where the story twists, again. According to sources close to the investigation, the timeline of the crime doesn't match Nick's supposed outburst. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds on Rob, no struggle from Michelle, just two quick, surgical, almost methodical attacks. And then Nick, barefoot, in the backyard, humming a tune his father used to play on the piano. Chilling, right? But what if I told you that months earlier, the Maid heard Nick rehearsing something in the guest house? Not music, not a film monologue, but a confrontation. She said it sounded like a boy talking to his father. Only there was no one else in the room. She walked past his window and heard him say, "Why didn't you love me? Why wasn't I enough? You loved your image more than your son." And then silence, except for the sound of something slamming into a wall. Let's rewind again. Because to understand how we got to this moment, we need to start with what the Maid saw when she first stepped into the Reiner estate. She was hired through an agency. No background check required. Just discretion. Day one. She was told 3 things. Don't go into the West Wing. Don't speak to Mr. Reiner unless spoken to. Don't, under any circumstances, wake Nick. Odd, right? She figured maybe he was a recluse. Maybe it was depression. Maybe he just didn't want to be bothered. But over time, she noticed something else. Nick wasn't just isolated. He was invisible. Photos of Rob with his co-stars lined the walls. Happy smiles with Billy Crystal, Tom Hanks. Even a framed shot of him and President Obama. But not one picture of Nick. Not even in his childhood bedroom. She once asked Michelle, casually, if they wanted help organizing old family albums. Michelle froze, then whispered, "We don't really look at those anymore," and walked away. Now, let's be honest. Families fight. Parents mess up. No one's perfect. But this wasn't normal dysfunction. This was erasure. The kind of emotional neglect that leaves a scar no camera can see. And Rob? He wasn't cruel in the way you'd expect. He wasn't a red-faced, table-flipping maniac. He was cold, strategic, a man who, according to the Maid, never yelled when outsiders were present, but could cut someone down with a single glance. The first time she saw it happen, Nick had just come into the kitchen asking if his dad had watched his short film, a 10-minute piece he submitted to a film festival. Rob looked at him and said, Do you think Spielberg would waste 10 minutes on your therapy homework? Nick didn't say a word. He just stood there, frozen. The maid said his eyes welled up, but he didn't cry. Not then. He just turned and walked away. And Rob? He laughed, took a sip of espresso, and said to Michelle, I told you, too soft. That's what you get. Michelle looked down at her plate, didn't say a word. Now, here's the part where it gets hard to watch. Because this isn't just about bad parenting or Hollywood ego. This is about a pattern, a system. Rob controlled everything. Who got access? Who got attention? Even who got affection. The maid recalls one afternoon when she brought Rob a phone message from a charity asking for a donation. He scoffed and said, Tell them I only do feel-good causes. She joked, Isn't that what family is for? He stared at her, long enough that she felt afraid, then said, Family's for legacy, not therapy. Let that sink in. Family's for legacy, not therapy. Is that how you see your loved ones? Or is that how a man sees the world when he's more invested in how he's remembered than how he lives? And maybe that's what broke Nick. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe it was 1,000 tiny cuts. A lifetime of not being enough. Because what happens when a child grows up being told he's broken? What happens when every emotion is treated like weakness? What happens when your own father, the one who created you, spends more time promoting fictional characters than protecting his real son? What happens? You tell me. The maid said Michelle once confessed something to her in a whisper. They were in the laundry room, folding towels, quiet. And Michelle said, Sometimes I feel like Nick is a mirror, showing Rob everything he hates about himself. And then she added, almost too quietly to hear, And sometimes I think Rob wants to smash that mirror. That line stayed with her, especially the night of the murders. Because when the maid was questioned by police, they asked if she had seen signs of violence before. She said no, but she had seen something worse. Indifference. The kind that eats away at people. The kind that makes you scream into pillows at night. The kind that turns a soft-hearted child into a hollow-eyed man pacing barefoot with a bloody towel in his hand. So when she found the note behind the fridge, sealed in a sandwich bag, marked for her, she knew it was meant for her eyes only. She opened it slowly, hands trembling, and inside, a single sentence, written in Nick's handwriting. 6 words. You saw it. You know what? That was it. No confession. No denial. No apology. Just a cold truth. She had seen it. And now? So will you. Because what comes next will blow apart everything you thought you knew about this family. The luxury. The legacy. The lies. Because while the world asked, how could Nick do this? No one asked, what did Rob do to Nick? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever stepped into a home and immediately felt something off? Not the kind of bad vibes people joke about. Something colder, heavier, like the walls were hiding secrets. Like the air itself had been holding its breath for years. That's how she described it. The housekeeper, who will call Elena to protect her identity, said it felt like walking into a haunted cathedral, bright on the outside, but inside, a place where something sacred had died long ago, and no one ever bothered to bury it. She arrived at the Brentwood mansion on a Tuesday. The agency gave her minimal details. Celebrity couple, discreet, no children in the home, job mainly cleaning and laundry, some light cooking. Just smile, say yes, and don't ask questions, the agency warned. She didn't. Not at first. The gate buzzed open like something out of a sci-fi movie. Camera hidden in the shrubs. Security on full display. She remembered thinking, wow, this is what a $13.5 million home looks like. But what struck her wasn't the size. It was the silence. No music. No laughter. No barking dogs or running children. Just silence. As she made her way up the gravel driveway, she noticed how pristine everything looked. Not clean, curated. Even the bushes were trimmed like museum sculptures. The front door opened before she could knock. And there stood Michelle Reiner. Hair tied back, simple pearl earrings, soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You must be Elena, Michelle said. Come in. Just take your shoes off first. The kind of voice that's sweet on the surface, but carries years of exhaustion underneath. As they entered, Michelle gestured toward the main hallway. Polished hardwood, high ceilings, family portraits, or what looked like them. Except no pictures of Nick. Not even as a toddler. Odd, right? Instead, the walls were filled with images of Rob, on movie sets, receiving awards, posing with politicians. Elena saw framed photos of Rob shaking hands with Barack Obama, sitting beside Morgan Freeman, and directing Tom Cruise. It was the kind of hallway you might expect in a museum, not a home. Still, Elena smiled and nodded politely. That's when she noticed the first red flag. There was a painting on the wall. An abstract piece, reds and blacks swirling in violent patterns. Right underneath it was a small plaque. Commissioned after Rob's Emmy loss, 1998. Elena chuckled. Michelle didn't. Instead, she paused and said softly, "Don't laugh at his things. Even when he's not around." The silence after that, sharp, cut through the room like a knife. The house tour continued. Michelle showed her the kitchen, the guest bathroom, the laundry setup in the back corridor. All standard. But when they reached the west wing, something changed. Michelle hesitated, placed a hand on the doorknob. "This is off limits," she said flatly. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Sorry. This hallway. This wing. Don't enter it. Don't clean it. Don't even walk past it at night." Then, before Elena could ask anything else, Michelle switched topics entirely. "You'll also never need to knock on the guest house door. That's Nick's space." She said it fast, like a reflex, like a warning. Now, imagine this. You're on your first day of work in one of the wealthiest homes in Los Angeles, and you're already being told there are doors you can't open and people you shouldn't speak to. That's not just protocol. That's fear. And Elena felt it instantly. She followed Michelle back into the main kitchen, where a list of daily chores had already been written in thick black marker on a whiteboard. Laundry, kitchen counters, vacuum living room, Polish piano, but do not play. Don't enter Nick's area. The last line was underlined twice. And then, at the very bottom, added in red. No personal questions. Ever. Elena thought it was strange. But this was Hollywood, after all. Strange is normal, right? She figured it was just celebrity eccentricity. Until she met Rob. He came downstairs around noon. No hello. No smile. Just a grunt, a nod, and a hand gesture toward his coffee mug. Michelle immediately jumped into action. Grabbing the French press, warming the mug, adding the splash of almond milk he preferred. Elena noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Rob sat at the breakfast bar, eyes glued to his phone, muttering about a script someone had sent him. "I told them Act 2 needed a punch," he said. "They gave me a nap." Michelle laughed softly. It sounded rehearsed. That's when he looked at Elena for the first time. "You knew?" he asked. "Yes, sir." That was it. No welcome. No name. Just HM. He took the coffee, sipped, and said, "Hot. Good," then walked away. That was her introduction to Rob Reiner, a man who could control a room without ever raising his voice or acknowledging anyone in it. But the moment that changed everything came that evening. Elena was wiping down the dining table when she heard something, faint but unmistakable, coming from the kitchen hallway. A voice. A boy's voice. At first, she thought maybe it was a TV. But then the voice cracked. "Why can't you just say you're proud of me?" The words echoed off the marble. Then Rob's voice. Low, cold, precise. "You want a gold star for doing what every other 32-year-old manages without whining." Another voice, Michelle's. Soft. Nervous. "Rob, please." "No, Michelle. He needs to hear it. You've coddled him his whole life. Look at him. Can't hold a job. Can't hold a thought. And now he wants applause for filming shadows in a garage." There was a pause. Then a crash. Like a glass shattering. And silence. Elena stood frozen. The kind of frozen you feel when you know something real has just happened, something you weren't supposed to hear. She tiptoed back toward the hallway, just enough to peek. What she saw made her stomach drop. Nick was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, his knees pulled into his chest. His face, blank. Not crying. Not yelling. Just gone. Like someone had unplugged the soul from his body. Michelle knelt next to him, whispering, holding a towel to his hand, blood dripping from where the glass had cut him. "Rob?" He was already walking away, muttering to himself, "Too soft. That's what happens." And then, and this is important, he looked back, saw Elena, didn't flinch, just said, "Clean that up, would you?" Elena didn't move at first. Her eyes locked on Rob's face, hoping, maybe, he'd say more, that he'd stop, that he'd realize what he'd just said, what he'd just done. But he didn't blink. He just turned and disappeared down the hallway like nothing had happened. Like his son wasn't bleeding. Like his wife wasn't crying. Like Elena was just another piece of furniture, there to serve, to clean, to erase whatever mess he didn't feel like dealing with. She took a slow step toward Nick. The towel Michelle was using was soaked red now. Should I call someone? Elena asked quietly. Michelle looked up, eyes rimmed with tears but dry now, like she'd run out of the energy for weeping. No, he just needs to lie down. Nick didn't respond. He wasn't even looking at them. He just kept staring at the fridge, his lips slightly parted, his breathing shallow. Elena lowered herself, helping gather the shattered glass. She tried not to look at the blood splatter near the counter leg. Tried not to inhale too sharply when her hand brushed against a small shard. Tried not to listen when Michelle whispered to Nick, "It's okay, sweetheart." He didn't mean it. He just doesn't know how to be different. Different. Not better. Not kinder. Just not like that. That was the moment Elena realized. This wasn't an isolated argument. This wasn't a bad day. This was the baseline. This was the house. The next day, the West Wing door was locked. She walked past it and noticed something new. A thin red line, barely visible, trailing from the kitchen tiles to the hallway carpet. She grabbed a rag and bent down. Rob appeared in the hallway out of nowhere. "Don't touch that," he barked. She froze. "It's taken care of," he added, calmer this time. "Stay in your lane." He walked off again, sipping his coffee. "No thank you. No explanation. Just the order. Just the wall." And again, the silence. You ever notice how some houses seem too quiet? Not peaceful quiet. Not cozy quiet. But funeral quiet? Elena said that's how the Reiner mansion felt after that first blow-up. Like the energy inside had turned to glass. Brittle. Shiny on the outside, but fragile if you press too hard. And over the next few weeks, she started noticing the patterns. Rob never yelled in front of guests. He reserved his comments for when it was just him, Michelle, and Nick. But even then, they weren't loud. They were strategic, calculated jabs, snide remarks, backhanded compliments that cut deeper than outright insults. Like when Nick came downstairs in a suit, trying to look presentable for a dinner meeting Rob had scheduled with a producer. Rob took one glance and said, "Try less funeral director, more someone who knows how to tell a joke." Nick changed clothes. The meeting never happened. But Michelle, God bless her, tried to keep the illusion alive. She hosted dinner parties, smiled in every photo, made polite conversation with the neighbors, donated to local causes. She even kept a gratitude journal, which Elena found once while organizing the bedroom. It was filled with lines like, "Nick seemed calm today. He even ate dinner. Rob made a joke and I laughed. It wasn't that funny, but I laughed anyway. The house was quiet today. Quiet is good, right?" That line stuck with Elena. Quiet is good, right? It was like Michelle was trying to convince herself, as if she knew the noise was coming. As if silence was just the eye of the storm. One afternoon, Elena brought fresh towels to the guest house. Usually, she just left them at the door. But this time, it was open a crack. She knocked. No answer. "Nick?" she called gently. Still nothing. She pushed the door open slightly. What she saw made her step back. Walls covered in post-it notes. Red, blue, and yellow, hundreds of them. Each one had a word or sentence on it. Failure. Echo chamber. No hugs after age 9. When did I stop being a son and become a problem? Is therapy real if he calls it weakness? Did she ever really try to stop him? The room felt more like a mind unraveling than a living space. There were notebooks stacked on the floor, some filled with scripts, others with stream of consciousness ramblings. One sentence repeated over and over. "He won't change. He doesn't have to." Elena stepped back, closed the door quietly. She didn't bring towels again for weeks. Then came the worst night yet. It was late, around 1 a.m. She was finishing dishes when she heard footsteps. Heavy, uneven. Nick. He was pacing the living room barefoot, muttering. Elena peeked from the kitchen doorway. He was talking to someone who wasn't there, hands gesturing wildly. "I told you I tried. You think I haven't begged him to see me?" She watched and said nothing. She always says nothing. And then, the sound of a lamp shattering. Elena ducked back into the shadows, heart pounding. Within seconds, Rob appeared at the top of the stairs in a robe. He didn't yell. He just stared, then said, "Nick, go to your room." Nick froze, breathing heavy, hands clenched, then whispered, Why won't you just be my dad? Rob didn't answer. He just turned and walked back upstairs. Elena didn't sleep that night. Neither did Nick. He paced for another 2 hours, then disappeared into the guest house just before dawn. The next morning, Rob left early for a meeting. Michelle was in the kitchen, staring into her coffee. Elena sat down across from her. Quiet. After a few minutes, Michelle said, "I should have left years ago." Then she added, "But I thought maybe if I stayed, I could protect him." Elena didn't know what to say. What could she say? Michelle looked older that morning, like she had aged 10 years overnight. And for once, she didn't fix her hair. She didn't smile. She just sat there, waiting for her coffee to cool. There was no one moment when things snapped. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a drip. A slow, steady leak of cruelty, silence, blame, guilt. A house that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, a pressure cooker. And the maid? She was just the witness. The woman with the mop and the memory. The woman who wasn't supposed to see what she saw or remember what she heard. But she did. And one moment, in particular, kept her up at night. It was the day she found Michelle staring at her reflection in the mirror, eyes glassy. She turned to Elena and asked, "Do you think Nick hates me more for what I let happen, or for not leaving when I had the chance?" Elena didn't answer. She just stood there, because no matter what she said, it would have been the wrong thing. Now ask yourself this. If you had seen all of this, lived through it for years, and then read a headline saying Rob Reiner was the victim of his son's madness, wouldn't you question it? Wouldn't you wonder, what pushed that son over the edge? Wouldn't you remember the blood on the towel? The post-it notes? The unanswered question, why won't you just be my dad? Because maybe the truth isn't about a killer. Maybe it's about what killed him long before he snapped. But if you think that's chilling, wait until you find out what the maid heard during her second week from the West Wing, a room she was never supposed to enter. But what came from behind that locked door changed everything. How do you grow up in a $13.5 million mansion, surrounded by Hollywood legends, and still feel like you don't exist? That was Nick Reiner's life. To the public, he was just a footnote, a name mentioned once or twice in articles about Rob's political activism or directorial triumphs. To his father, he was a problem to be managed, not a person to be known. Invisible, ignored when quiet, shamed when loud. The maid called it the vanishing act, because Rob didn't scream Nick out of the room. He simply acted like he was never there. And that, somehow, was worse. Let's go back. Nick was born in 1993, long after Rob had already cemented his legacy in Hollywood. By that time, Stand By Me had made him a critical darling. When Harry Met Sally had become a cultural phenomenon. He'd worked with the best. He was the best. But according to insiders close to the family, Rob never really planned for Nick. At least, not emotionally. Professionally, Rob was a powerhouse. Personally, he was guarded, often distant. He married Michelle Singer in 1989. Friends described her as gentle, reserved, almost ethereal in her softness. A perfect counterbalance to Rob's strong opinions and intense energy. But when Nick was born, that balance cracked. Not because of the baby, but because Rob didn't know how to connect with someone who needed him to be vulnerable, not brilliant. From the very beginning, Nick didn't fit the mold. He wasn't loud, wasn't charismatic, wasn't obsessed with the spotlight. He liked books, music, drawing. He cried easily, got overwhelmed at loud noises, hated conflict. And Rob? He didn't understand that. Or worse, he didn't try to. The maid said she once overheard Rob say to a friend on the phone, "I don't know what to do with him. He's soft. I can't raise a poet. I need a man." That line echoed through the house. Because from that point forward, Nick's every behavior was judged against that invisible measuring stick. Too quiet? Weak. Too emotional? Embarrassment. Too dependent on his mom? She's ruining him. By the time he was 10, Nick had learned the rules. Be invisible. Don't cry. Don't expect hugs. Don't talk during Dad's interviews. And if Rob ever brought someone over, disappear into the guest house. Or better yet, don't be home at all. Elena didn't meet young Nick. By the time she was hired, he was already in his early 30s. But the house carried the weight of his childhood. You could feel it in the photos that weren't there. You could feel it in the piano no one played. You could feel it in the way Michelle flinched when a door slammed too hard. She was always protecting him. But from what? The outside world? Or the man pacing the halls with a script in one hand and an unchecked rage in the other? One morning, Elena stumbled upon a box in the laundry room. It had been mislabeled holiday napkins. Inside, dozens of Nick's childhood drawings, crayon sketches, doodles on lined paper. Most were portraits, stick figures of me and Mom. One said, me and Dad, but Rob's figure was drawn with no face. Another showed the Reiner mansion, with arrows pointing to safe spots. One arrow pointed to a closet, another to a tree outside, written in a child's handwriting. When yelling starts, go here. Elena brought the box to Michelle. She looked at it, touched one drawing, and whispered, he used to hide behind the dryer when Rob got upset. Then she closed the box, locked it in a cabinet, and said, don't show him these. Please. He's trying to forget. Trying to forget. But how do you forget what you were trained to fear? Nick's adolescence was no easier. According to school records and old staff testimony, he attended several private schools, but never stayed long. He struggled with anxiety, social withdrawal, a diagnosis of depression at age 14. At 15, he was caught self-harming. At 17, he attempted overdose. That's when the Reiners sent him to a high-end rehabilitation facility in Arizona, the kind of place celebrities sent their troubled kids. Publicly, Rob was praised for getting his son help. Privately, he told a friend, it's damage control. He's a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Elena would hear that story later, from a former chef who worked the estate during that time, and it made her stomach turn, because Nick wasn't a PR nightmare. He was a kid, a broken kid, trying to earn love that came with asterisks. When Nick returned from rehab, the guest house was remodeled. What used to be a pool cabana was turned into a self-contained mini apartment. Own kitchen, own entrance, own rules. It looked like independence, but it felt like exile. Nick rarely came into the main house. Meals were left at the door. Staff were told not to engage unless invited. One day, Elena saw Nick through the window. He was playing the piano, eyes closed, shoulders shaking. She stepped closer. The music was haunting, fragile, the kind that comes from pain, not practice. She told Michelle about it later. Michelle smiled, but it didn't last. Rob made him stop piano lessons at 10, she said. Said it was too emotional. Elena asked why. Michelle looked down. Because the first time he played, he cried. And Rob said boys who cry at music don't survive in Hollywood. That was the moment Elena realized Nick hadn't been raised. He'd been silenced. And now? Now he was unraveling in a soundproof room, while the world praised his father as a voice for justice. But here's the twist. Despite everything, the emotional neglect, the verbal jabs, the suffocating expectations, Nick still wanted to make his father proud. He still submitted short films to indie festivals, still pitched scripts to Rob's former colleagues, still asked Michelle to read his monologues and tell him if she thought Dad would like this. And sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, he would whisper to himself, one day he'll say it. One day he'll say he's proud. But Rob never said it. Not once. Not even after Nick's short documentary won an award at a small festival in Silver Lake. Rob didn't attend, didn't watch, didn't mention it. Just asked Elena to change the channel when a news clip came on. He's still playing dress up, Rob muttered. Elena excused herself, went into the pantry, and cried. Because it wasn't her child, but it felt like it was. Because she'd seen the glimmers in Nick's eyes when he worked on his projects. The need in his voice when he asked if anyone had seen his footage. And the silence that followed when no one cared. That silence. It was the loudest thing in the house. It echoed through every corridor. It lived in the locked rooms, the sealed boxes, the photo albums with missing years. It lived in Michelle's drawn face, in Nick's hunched shoulders, in the sound of post-it notes being scribbled at 3 a.m. And most of all, it lived in Rob's indifference. Because Rob Reiner wasn't just absent. He was deliberately absent. The kind of father who showed up for protests but not for parent-teacher conferences. The kind who fought for the soul of a nation, while slowly crushing the soul of his son. And then came the moment Elena would never forget. She was cleaning the upstairs study when she found a journal under a pile of old scripts. Not Nick's, Rob's. It was a leather-bound planner, filled with schedules, ideas, half-written quotes. But at the back, a list, titled, What Nick is Not. Not charismatic, not funny, not useful, not salvageable, not mine. That last line stopped her cold. Not mine. She closed the book, put it back. and left the room. But that sentence stayed with her. Because whatever happened next, she now believed it started there. Not with rage, but with rejection. A rejection so complete, it made a son question his own existence. But Elena had no idea that within weeks, Nick would stop questioning and start acting. And what he did next would shock the world. Let's be clear about something. Nick Reiner didn't just snap. There was no single trigger. No explosion out of nowhere. This wasn't a sudden burst of violence. This was a slow-motion collapse. A soul-eroding, day by day, comment by comment, silence by silence, until there was nothing left to hold it up. And the final straw wasn't a scream. It was a shrug. It happened 2 weeks before the murders. Nick had finished editing a new short film, one he'd worked on for months. It was autobiographical, raw, painful. He called it Through the Glass. It was only 10 minutes long, but it told the story of a boy raised in a house where love was locked behind closed doors, and the key was always just out of reach. He used actors, sure, but it was him. Everyone could see that. He left a flash drive on Rob's desk. Michelle told Elena he'd waited up all night, pacing, not eating, just waiting. The next morning, Rob handed the flash drive back without looking up from his phone. Too personal, he said. Also, not compelling. That was it. No feedback. No encouragement. Not even a full sentence. Nick didn't speak for 2 days after that. Elena saw it. She tried not to intrude. Tried to give him space. But one night, she saw his door was ajar, and inside, he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by post-its. He didn't look up. He just whispered, "I think I died a long time ago. I just forgot to bury myself." She stepped in, sat beside him, didn't speak. He handed her a folded piece of paper, a sketch. It showed 3 figures, a towering man with a crown, a small boy curled in a corner, and a woman, hands outstretched, but tied at the wrists. At the top, a single word, stage. Everything was a performance, even the pain, especially the pain. A few days later, Elena overheard Michelle pleading with Rob. She didn't mean for anyone to hear. But the office door was open a crack. "He's getting worse," she said. "You have to talk to him." Rob replied, "What would I even say? How about, 'I love you'?" Silence. Then, "I'm not going to lie to the boy." Michelle's voice broke. "He's not a boy, Rob. He's our son. He needs his father. Not a director. Not a political pundit. Just you." Rob snapped. "I don't know him what I never got. You think my dad coddled me? You think I got hugs? You either grow up or get left behind." Michelle's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's already behind, Rob. We just keep pretending he's not." Elena backed away. She didn't want them to know she'd heard. But deep down, she knew. They were all pretending. Then came that night. The dinner. The last time the Reiner family ever sat at the same table. Elena was in the kitchen, preparing plates. She heard the laughter first. Light, forced, artificial. Then came the wine pouring. The clinking of silverware. And then, the moment. It started with a toast. Nick raised his glass and said, "To family. The one role you don't get to audition for." A long silence. Then Rob chuckled. "That's cute." Nick pushed further. "You know, I made a new short film. Thought maybe we could all watch it together." Rob didn't even look up. "Not tonight." Nick's voice tightened. "You never watched them." Michelle interjected. "Rob, maybe just." "I said not tonight." Nick stared at his father. "Why do you hate me?" Rob took a bite of steak. "Don't be dramatic. You've never said you're proud of me. That's because you haven't given me a reason to be." The silence was so thick, Elena said it felt like the air had collapsed. Nick stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the marble. He walked out of the room. Michelle followed. Rob stayed seated, sipped his wine, then said, to no one in particular, "Weak men make messy art." Elena knew in that moment. Something irreversible had happened. The next day, Nick didn't come out of the guest house. Not for breakfast. Not for lunch. Not even when Michelle brought him food herself. She left it by the door. He didn't touch it. That night, Elena walked past the guest house and saw the lights flickering, a projector running on loop. It was Through the Glass. Over, and over, and over. The boy in the film sat in a corner, silent, watching his own life repeat. A prisoner in a home that felt more like a mausoleum. Michelle tried one last time. Elena saw her leave a note by the door. She doesn't know what it said, but she watched Michelle pace afterward. Hands clenched, breathing sharp. as if she were the one on the edge of a breakdown. And maybe she was. Maybe they all were. Because the truth was, no one in that house was well. Not Rob. Not Nick. Not even Michelle. They were trapped in a family portrait that had been airbrushed to hide the bruises. But behind the glass, everything was cracking. That's when Elena made a decision. She would tell someone. She didn't know who. Maybe the agency. Maybe someone outside the family. But she couldn't stay silent anymore. She started keeping notes. Little things Nick would say. How often Michelle cried when no one was watching. The way Rob's voice dropped to a hiss whenever Nick's name came up. And one note, the one that haunted her the most, came the night before the murders. She heard Nick muttering in the backyard. Just one sentence. Over and over. They'll see. They'll see. They'll see. Elena didn't sleep that night. And by morning, Rob and Michelle were gone. Stabbed. Murdered. The perfect family, shattered. But if anyone was surprised, it wasn't Elena. Because she'd seen the warning signs. She just didn't know they were countdowns. So now ask yourself, was Nick Reiner a monster? Or was he a mirror, reflecting back everything this perfect Hollywood home tried so hard to hide? Because before he became a headline, he was a ghost in his own life. An invisible son, begging to be seen. And when he couldn't get love, he got noticed. But what came next would reveal that Michelle wasn't just a bystander. She may have tried to stop it. And what she left behind was the first piece of the puzzle. How long can someone live in silence before it kills them, piece by piece? Michelle Reiner was the kind of woman people called graceful, elegant, soft-spoken. The kind of woman who blended into the background at red carpets, her hand always tucked gently into Rob's arm, her smile poised, eyes steady. But Elena, the maid, saw something different. She saw the pauses, the weight behind every smile, the way Michelle's shoulders stiffened when Rob walked into the room, the way her voice dropped when Nick's name was mentioned. She wasn't a silent woman by nature. She was made that way, conditioned to hold her breath every time Rob opened his mouth. And what made it all worse? She loved them both, her husband and her son, even when loving them meant becoming the bridge between two cliffs, knowing she'd be the one to break if they ever pulled too far in either direction. Elena would later say Michelle didn't suffer loudly. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no bruises, just absence. The absence of laughter, the absence of connection, the absence of choice. It showed up in small ways. Like how Michelle never sat at the head of the table, how she always served Rob first, even when he was late, how she apologized for Nick when Rob insulted him in front of others. The silence wasn't peace. It was strategy, survival. The first time Elena saw Michelle cry, it wasn't because of Rob. It was because of Nick. He'd just left the house after another tense dinner. Something about wasted potential, Rob's favorite phrase. Elena walked into the dining room expecting to find empty plates. Instead, she found Michelle standing alone, still holding Nick's untouched wine glass. She wasn't sobbing, just crying, quietly, tears sliding down like she didn't even notice them. Elena stepped forward. Michelle didn't flinch. She just whispered, to no one in particular. He used to draw me pictures. Every morning. Then she set the glass down, wiped her face, and walked away. But here's where the contradiction deepens. Michelle wasn't a doormat. She wasn't weak. In fact, Elena would argue she was the strongest person in that house. Because it takes strength to survive that kind of emotional crossfire and still choose compassion every single day. She protected Nick, as much as Rob would allow. She watched over him like a guard dog in pearls. Whenever Rob's temper flared, Michelle would redirect. Change the subject. Offer to make tea. Slide her hand across his knuckles, grounding him. It didn't always work, but sometimes it did. And those moments? They were enough to keep her trying. One day, while sorting laundry, Elena noticed a small notebook hidden beneath a pile of Michelle's scarves. It was spiral-bound, edges frayed, pages yellowed at the corners. She didn't mean to read it, but the first page was open, and the line caught her breath. I sleep in pieces now. 1 hour for Rob. 1 hour for Nick. 1 hour for myself. When I remember who that even is. She flipped through quickly. What she found was less a journal and more a confession. Michelle wrote letters. To no one. To everyone. Sometimes to herself. Sometimes to Nick. Once, to Rob. That one said, "You were supposed to be the safe place. You were supposed to be our protector. But somewhere along the way, Your ambition became our dictator. Elena closed the book, carefully placed it back. But those words, dictator, clung to her. You ever wonder how someone ends up with a man like Rob? It's easy to assume she was naive, or desperate, or shallow. But Michelle wasn't any of those things. She was kind, loyal, and she believed in him. That was her fatal flaw. She believed he could change, that the warmth she saw on their honeymoon, the laughter, the gentleness, was real, and that maybe if she stayed, if she worked hard enough, it would come back. But it didn't. It calcified, turned into routines, then resentments, then regret. By the time Nick was old enough to ask why Daddy didn't come to his school plays, Michelle had already stopped making excuses. She just said, "He's busy," and left it at that. Rob wasn't always cruel, and maybe that's what made it harder. He had good days. He brought Michelle coffee in bed, told her she was the reason he could breathe in a town filled with egos. Even danced with her once in the kitchen to an old Ella Fitzgerald song. But those moments were bookends. The real story lived in the middle, in the space where his love turned conditional, where his silence became punishment, where his jokes at her expense were met with polite laughter from guests and exhausted smiles from Michelle. Elena said the saddest part wasn't that Michelle stayed. It's that she stayed hopeful. Michelle believed she could hold it all together. And maybe for a while, she did. She kept Nick from spiraling further, kept Rob from exploding in public. She smoothed the cracks. But cracks don't disappear. They widen. And Michelle? She was running out of plaster. Elena noticed it in her eyes. The way she flinched at sudden noises. The way she hesitated before knocking on Nick's door. The way she started forgetting things, appointments, names, her own stories. One day, while watering the plants, Michelle stared out the window for nearly 20 minutes. Elena found her standing there, eyes glassy. When she asked if everything was okay, Michelle smiled and said, "I was just thinking, if this was all a movie, I don't think I'd survive the third act." It wasn't a joke. It wasn't even a metaphor. It was prophecy, and Elena didn't know it yet. But Michelle had already started writing her ending, and it began with a sealed envelope. What kind of woman prepares for the end without telling anyone she's afraid? Michelle did. Not with drama, not with threats, not with ultimatums. She did it the only way she knew how, quietly. The envelope appeared one afternoon when the house was unusually still. Rob was out. A meeting, maybe a lunch, maybe just an excuse to avoid the tension that had settled into the walls like mold. Nick hadn't come out of the guest house in 2 days. Elena was folding linens when Michelle walked in, holding a small cream-colored envelope. No return address. No stamp. Just Elena's name written in careful handwriting. "I need you to hold on to this," Michelle said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Elena frowned. "Is everything okay?" Michelle smiled. That same practiced smile she wore at charity galas. "Yes," she said. "Everything is fine." But her hands were shaking. Elena noticed that. She always noticed. "Just promise me," Michelle continued. "You won't open it unless something happens." "What kind of something?" Michelle hesitated, then said, "The kind that makes people tell stories. The kind that turns lives into headlines." Elena wanted to ask more. She didn't. Because something in Michelle's eyes said this wasn't a conversation. It was a goodbye disguised as an errand. From that day on, Michelle changed. Not in a way most people would notice. But Elena did. She always woke earlier. She stopped correcting Rob when he misremembered things. Stopped defending Nick during arguments. Not because she didn't care, but because she was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your soul and tells you nothing you do will ever be enough. She started giving things away. Clothes, jewelry, old cookbooks. One morning, Elena found a box of Michelle's scarves neatly folded on the guest house porch. "Give these to Nick," Michelle said when asked. "He doesn't like scarves," Elena replied. "I know," Michelle said, "but I do. And maybe he'll remember me when it's cold." That sentence haunted Elena, because it wasn't about scarves. It was about absence. Michelle tried one last thing. One final attempt to bridge the gap she'd been standing on for decades. She asked Rob to attend a therapy session with Nick. Just one. No cameras. No press. No talking points. Just the three of them. Rob laughed. "You want me to sit in a room and listen to him complain about his childhood?" He scoffed. "I had a childhood too. No one handed me a trophy for surviving it." Michelle didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just said, "Then we're running out of time." Rob rolled his eyes. That's melodrama. But Michelle knew. And deep down, so did he. That night, Elena heard Michelle crying in the bathroom. Not sobbing. Not hysterical. Just a low, steady sound, like air leaking from a balloon. She knocked gently. "Michelle." Silence. Then the door opened. Michelle's face was pale. Her eyes red. "I tried," she said. "I really did." Elena didn't know what she meant. But she nodded anyway. Because sometimes people don't need answers. They need witnesses. Over the next few days, Michelle began documenting things. Phone calls. Arguments. Dates. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Times when Rob dismissed Nick. Moments when Nick spiraled. Things Michelle wished she'd handled differently. Elena saw the papers once, stacked neatly in a folder labeled "just in case." She didn't read them. She didn't have to. She already knew what they said. The day before the murders, Michelle asked Elena to sit with her in the garden. They watched the sun dip behind the hedges. Nick's guest house lights flickered on. Rob was late again. Michelle broke the silence. "Do you think people can love each other and still destroy one another?" Elena thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I think that happens all the time." Michelle nodded. "Then promise me something. Anything. If they turn this into a story, don't let them forget the middle." The middle. The part where no one is innocent. The part where love isn't enough. The part where silence does the most damage. Elena swallowed. "I promise." Michelle reached for her hand, held it tight, and for the first time since Elena had known her, she looked relieved. That night, Michelle didn't sleep. Elena knew because she heard her pacing. Soft footsteps. Back and forth. Back and forth. At one point, Michelle stood outside Nick's guest house door. She didn't knock. She just rested her forehead against the wood, whispered something Elena couldn't hear, then walked away. The next morning, everything unraveled. When the police arrived, the house was chaos. Lights, voices, questions. Elena stood frozen in the kitchen, replaying every conversation she'd ever had with Michelle. Every pause, every sigh, every almost said thing. When an officer asked if Michelle had seemed off lately, Elena hesitated, then said she seemed resolved. The officer raised an eyebrow. Resolved how? Like someone who'd already accepted the ending. In the days that followed, Michelle's name was reduced to a headline. Wife. Victim. Spouse of. No one talked about the woman who spent decades cushioning the blows. No one talked about the mother who stayed too long because she believed staying meant protecting. No one talked about the quiet suffering that hollowed her out from the inside. Except Elena. And the envelope. Because when the world started pointing fingers, and the story hardened into something simple and brutal, Elena opened it. Inside was a letter, written in Michelle's careful script, and it changed everything. But that letter? That comes next. Because what Michelle confessed, in her own words, would challenge every narrative and force one terrifying question. What if the real tragedy wasn't the violence, but the silence that came before it? What if the real tragedy wasn't the violence, but the silence that came before it? What if the man the world applauded was the same man his family feared? That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. Because outside the gates of that Brentwood mansion, Rob Reiner wasn't a tyrant. He was a hero, a champion of justice, a moral compass in Hollywood chaos, a man who spoke loudly about kindness, empathy, and accountability. On television, he was warm, passionate, convincing. But at home? According to the people who lived with him, he was something else entirely. And the gap between those two versions of Rob Reiner? That gap swallowed his family whole. Elena used to watch Rob on TV from the kitchen, wiping counters while he debated politics or spoke about compassion on late-night shows. She remembers thinking, if only people knew. Not because he was evil all the time, but because the man on screen was a performance. And Rob Reiner was very good at performances. He knew timing, delivery, optics. He knew how to say the right thing, at the right moment, to the right audience. And he knew something else too. How to control a narrative. Inside the house, Rob was obsessed with how things looked, not how they felt. Appearances mattered. Perception mattered. Image was everything. Nick's struggles? A liability. Michelle's emotions? Inconvenient. Elena noticed it immediately during Rob's first fundraiser hosted at the house. Politicians, producers, activists, everyone smiling, laughing. Rob moving through the room like a general, confident, charming, unstoppable. Nick was told to stay in the guest house. Tonight's not about family, Rob said earlier. It's about the cause. Nick nodded, went outside, shut the door, and disappeared. During the party, a guest asked Michelle if she had children. She smiled politely. Yes, a son. How wonderful, the woman said. Is he in the industry too? Michelle hesitated, just a second too long. He's figuring things out, she replied. From across the room, Rob watched. Later, Elena overheard him say, You didn't have to mention him. It complicates things. That was Rob's language. People weren't people. They were complications. Rob liked to say he came from a tough love background. He wore it like a badge. I didn't get coddled, he'd say. I earned everything. But Elena noticed something odd. When Rob talked about his childhood, it was always vague. No stories. No names. No warmth. Just statements. Almost rehearsed. Like lines he'd memorized to justify how he treated others. And Nick? Nick was the collateral damage of that justification. One afternoon, Elena overheard Rob on the phone with a colleague. He was pacing the living room, voice sharp. I can't babysit a grown man's feelings, he said. At some point, you either rise to the occasion or you don't. Pause. No, it's not my job to fix him. Another pause. I didn't break him. That sentence echoed. Because everyone in that house knew, whether Rob admitted it or not, that something had been broken, and it hadn't happened overnight. Rob's public persona thrived on accountability, calling people out, demanding apologies, insisting on consequences. But inside his own home, accountability didn't apply. If Nick reacted emotionally, Rob called it weakness. If Michelle objected, Rob called it overreaction. If tension rose, Rob blamed everyone else for not handling pressure. He was always the calm one, the rational one, the victim of other people's emotions. And that made him untouchable. Elena once asked Michelle how she managed it, how she stayed composed when Rob dismissed her so casually. Michelle's answer was quiet. I learned that if I don't react, he loses interest. That wasn't peace. That was training. Rob didn't hit. He didn't threaten. He didn't swear. He withdrew. Affection, validation, presence. And that withdrawal was devastating. Because love, when withheld deliberately, becomes a weapon. Nick felt it. Michelle felt it. Elena saw it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the part people struggle with. Rob Reiner wasn't a cartoon villain. He was charming, funny, generous to causes he believed in. That's why this story is uncomfortable. Because it forces a question most people don't want to ask. Can someone fight for justice publicly and still be unjust privately? Can someone preach compassion and practice control? Can someone be admired by millions and feared by the people closest to them? Because if the answer is yes, then this story isn't just about one family. It's about power. And what happens when no one challenges it? Rob rarely raised his voice. But when he did, the house froze. Elena remembers one moment clearly. Nick had interrupted a conversation Rob was having with a visiting producer. Just a question about dinner plans. Rob didn't yell. He smiled and said, Nick, adults are speaking. The producer laughed. Nick went silent. Later that night, Elena heard Nick pacing and whispering, I'm 32. Why does he still call me a child? Because Rob needed him to be. Children don't challenge authority. The more Rob's public influence grew, the smaller Nick became. The more Rob was praised, the more Nick retreated. The imbalance was total, and Michelle stood in the middle, trying to soften the edges, absorb the blows, translate the silences. But even she was losing ground. Because when power goes unchecked, it doesn't just corrupt, it isolates. And Rob Reiner had isolated himself from the truth, from his son, from his wife, from the consequences of his own behavior. Elena believes something else too, something chilling. She believes Rob thought he was right, that everything he did, every cold comment, every dismissal, every absence, was justified, necessary, educational. And that belief, that's what made him dangerous. Not rage, not violence, but certainty. Because when someone believes they're always right, they stop listening. And when they stop listening, people break, families fracture, and tragedies are born quietly, long before blood is ever spilled. But what Elena discovered next would prove that Rob wasn't just indifferent. He was actively shaping the narrative, controlling the story even inside his own home. And the moment she realized that, was the moment she knew this was going to end badly, because behind the public ally was a private nightmare, and the nightmare was about to escalate. Behind the public ally was a private nightmare, and the nightmare was about to escalate. It started with a call sheet, not a film schedule, not a production timeline, a home call sheet, typed, printed, laminated, posted discreetly inside Rob's personal office. Elena saw it by accident while dusting. It was labeled, Household Flow, Optimal Hours for Peace. It listed times for when staff should be seen and when they shouldn't. When Nick should have